Welcome back to another episode of The Beginner's Guide to the 18th Century. My name is Kendall, and we are back for an exciting, fun, lively episode this week. And I am so thrilled to introduce to you Samantha Bullitt, who is a historical costumer for the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Samantha, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk.
I am so glad to have you here. I've been following you for a long time on Instagram, and I was just saying to you before we started recording that it's so unusual to see you not in costumes. It's like that. You're like, oh, wait a minute. You make exquisite, beautiful things, and we're going to talk about all of that because I know that people are watching this and they're, have lots of thoughts and ideas and questions. So we'll get to all of those. But first, what I would love to know is how you got into the living history community. How did all this start for you?
Yeah, I don't know if this is like unusual or usual. I don't have like any family connection to living history. No one else in my family does it at all. So I started when I was a teenager. I was 15 years old. And in my hometown of Huntington Beach, California, there is a Civil War reenactment that happens every year. And I just thought it seemed like the coolest thing. I've always been interested in costumes, specifically historic costume. I've always been really drawn to, but pretty much anything costume related. I loved, did tons of theater, that sort of thing. But I went to this reenactment and was like, I need to figure out how to do this. It was like, this is what I've always wanted, to find out that there are other people like you, basically, that are interested in history and trying to understand history through, dressing and cooking and creating things from the past. So that was really exciting. But I also had the limitations of being a teenager and, having allowance money, but not really the funds to get in fully. But I was lucky to find that I had friends who were already doing reenactment. So I joined their unit just as a matter of practicality. But the military aspect of it is always going to be hard for an individual female representing person to get into for various reasons. So luckily, as like my journey continued, I was able to find spaces that were better, more comfortable for me to be and to pursue the kind of living history that I wanted to do. But that took time. So I think I hit my interest in living history and specifically historical costuming at a time when the internet was becoming like the source for information. And it seems so long ago. It was like over 10 years ago now, but LiveJournal was huge in the historical, and I feel like I'm dating myself, which is like, I know I'm not like that old, but it's just so funny.
But like 12 lifetimes have happened since 2010 and Blackberries. So,
yes.
Right?
So, yeah, the LiveJournal community was just so amazing. I remember reading people's journals, especially people like Catherine Karen Grieg, who was Koshka the Cat, and Jenny Rose was on LiveJournal, like all these people that I just idolized and was like, wow. And they were so, the thing I loved about LiveJournal is just how much everybody was willing to share all of their, everything that they were trying, everything that they were learning. And that is definitely one of the things that I appreciate and that really helped me to grow, was just the fact that people were so open and happy to share what they were learning. So that was a lovely community to be a part of, and it has since morphed, and now we're on Instagram and YouTube. But I think that core is still there of helping people. So yeah, it was a lot of me in my bedroom in my parents' house, like just trying to figure things out. And funnily enough, I started sewing entirely by hand because I didn't have a sewing machine. So I just figured, well, I'll just do it by hand. It's period correct, and I don't really have any other way to get it done. So I kind of fell into it that way and have since kind of gone back to get better at the sewing machine. So I use it every day. I've learned to use a serger, but I still love hand sewing, and yeah.
So you, okay, so you're in California.
Yes.
Which does not have quite the living history community
It
that
does
the
not.
East Coast
No, it
does.
does not.
But you persevere, right?
I did persevere.
Figure it out, yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, there is a really interesting community in specifically Southern California, which I'm familiar with. There's a really big Victorian and vintage dance community that was great. So a lot of us costumers would go to those dances just to have an opportunity to wear our stuff. There were a decent amount of Civil War reenactments, but it's always weird because you're trying to reenact stuff that didn't actually take place in that area. And yeah. the memories that stand out in my mind most are the most like incongruous ones, where we did a battle reenactment for a few years outside of Knott's Berry Farm, which for people who don't know is an amusement park. So we had roller coasters and stuff going on behind us while we were, set up for living history. But it was what I could do at the time, and just try to make the most of it. But it's also the home of costume college. So I was really, really lucky to be able to start going to costume college when I was 16, because it was, like in my backyard, basically. And that was just another awesome resource that has since grown into, this crazy, wonderful thing. So I was really lucky in that way too, to be able to network with people, meet people, and yeah, so that was really great. And then I did eventually come out to the East Coast.
I was gonna say, how did you get from there to here?
Yeah, well, again, it was pretty much through the LiveJournal community in a weird way. I met one of my really good friends, Katie, through LiveJournal, and she happened to be best friends at the time with my husband now. So that was how we made that connection. They were in Michigan, and Michigan had more living history opportunities than California. So that was my first jump back further east. And then got to do some really cool stuff there. Civil War, we also did War of 1812 during the bicentennial, which was fun because it's really America's kind of forgotten war. So to look at that history was great. But then my husband got his apprenticeship in the tailor shop at Colonial Williamsburg. So that's what moved us out here 7, 8 years ago. So,
and did you go to school and major in costuming, fashion?
No, I majored in history. At the time, I thought I was going to be a teacher, and because I was like, what can I do with a history degree? I can teach. For some reason, museums weren't really on my radar. And I honestly don't know for like the average person how much museum work is on the radar as like an achievable job. But there's so much to do in museums. Any skill that you have can really be put to use in a museum. It's one of the things that I find really cool about it. Like, I've done tons of film work and all sorts of things I never thought I would do if I were working in a museum. Mm-hmm. So I majored in history, and every chance I got on a project or an assignment, I would gear it towards historical clothing to try and tie that in. So that really helped form my approach towards research, because I had it rooted in academics. And then the summer between my junior and senior year was when I had an internship in the millinery shop at Colonial Williamsburg. And that was when I was like, introduced to the world of museum work, realized this could be a career. And so that's what I decided I would try and go for once I got out here.
And then it happened. And now
it did
in
happen.
Museum.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the crazy thing, is that it did happen, and it doesn't always work out like that. Yeah. But it just happened. There happened to be that position open about 4 or 5 months after I got here. But the interim was spent me working on George Washington's tent recreation project, which was a joint project between Colonial Williamsburg and Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. So I hand sewed a huge tent, which I don't need to do ever again, but it was a good experience.
I've seen the photos. I didn't know that you were part of that, but I've seen the photos on Instagram of that. So
yeah, it was
good to know the other side of it. Like, I never need to hand sew a tent. That's on my resume. That's a one and done.
Exactly.
Next.
Exactly. I'm good, but I did it. So
you have your PhD in hand sewing George Washington's tent replication.
Pretty much. It was crazy, but I definitely enjoyed the experience. So
you do a variety of eras. You don't seem like you're just stuck in the 18th century according to your photographs.
No.
I guess if this is a girl who gets into Civil War in California in high school, you're gonna like to experiment with a lot of things, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's so funny because when I started doing Civil War, 18th century was always like my dream century, and it seemed so unattainable in a way. I think it's gotten a lot more accessible since that time. I mean, we have things like your business and American Duchess, and just like there's so much more available now than there was back when I wanted to get into 18th century. I definitely understand like looking at that time period and being like, how do I do that? I think starting in the mid 19th century, the construction is just so different. There's really not much like 18th century mantua making any other time in Western dressmaking. Like, it's just its own creature, and that definitely makes it harder if your goal is like accuracy. If you want to go straight for, I want the most accurate thing possible, 18th century is not necessarily like the easiest, because it's so much less straightforward in the time period. Like, women mantua makers are not using patterns during the 18th century. The sewing machine being introduced in the 19th century makes sewing and dressmaking so much more accessible for the average woman. And that just wasn't the case in the 18th century. So that's another thing that I like try to remind myself and other people who are getting into historic costuming is we have to take it upon ourselves to learn and become masters of a myriad of trades that individual people spent, 5 to 7 years of their life learning how to do.
In where you are, the work you're doing, Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, time periods. So you guys, you guys are doing very early colonies.
Right. Yeah, for Jamestown, we are doing pretty much the first quarter of the 17th century. And then at Yorktown, we do Battle of Yorktown, 1781.
Right. Okay.
And, before and a little bit after that. So that, I was like, okay, I know how to do that. But for the early 17th century, there's so much that we don't know just because it doesn't survive the way it does for the 18th century. So that's when I have to be open to, I can only do the best I have with the information that I have at this time right now. So the things I make, I may discover something in 5 or 10 years and have to, start all over or come up with a different way of doing things, and that's okay. And that's true for all time periods, really, but especially the earlier you get, the more you have to be willing to do that experimentation and to say that I'm always going to be learning about this time period. And it does make it fun, though, because I feel like I'm always going to be looking for that missing bit of information or that that image that's going to answer my questions on X, Y, or Z. So in that sense, it is really fun. I think the most frustrating thing, though, about the early 17th century is that because the people we're representing came from England, where the backbone of the economy is wool. They're all wearing wool. It's the little ice age. Then they come here to Virginia, and it's really hot. And we're also dealing with a current climate that is very different from the climate in the 17th century anyway. That makes it challenging to put 21st century people into early 17th century clothing and keep them healthy and, not passing out when it's 100 degrees and 83% humidity. It gets easier in the 18th century because cotton becomes cheaper. It's a much more common fabric. Linen is used a lot more for clothing. It's not used to the same extent in the early 17th century. It's still a lot of wool. So there's those interesting things that you have to deal with. And, I can't force anybody to do anything, but I can encourage them to, keep their 17th century mindset on. And yeah.
What do you think they were doing back then when they come over here in that wool and they get here? What do you think they did?
Well, one thing, we know that one person died. Yeah.
Be so stubborn about the wool that you die.
Well, it was early on. It's the first group of men who come over, and it's the only recorded death on that voyage was they get to one of the Caribbean islands and the guy is just like, it's too hot, basically. But we actually don't know specifically what they did. We do know that they requested more linen clothing. But outside of that, we don't know specifically. So what I do is look back at the English and European counterparts for clues about what they're doing, and then try to interpret that for Jamestown. You see a lot of guys really just in their shirts and breeches, because when it gets that hot, any notion of, propriety or whatever kind of goes out the window. So when I can look at an image, specifically these workers in a field who are cutting hay, they're just in their shirts and breeches. And so that's what the guys can do out at Jamestown and make it work. Just try to stay hydrated, really.
Yeah. So do you ever, because you deal with so many different time periods, like in your profession, in your hobby and all this stuff, do you ever feel like you get stuck in one time period and you like need to move on to another one, but it's hard to, or vice versa? Like, I don't know, like just, I know I imagine some people I've talked to, it's hard when you have, when you do lots of time periods, just kind of like moving through them and finding a flow.
Honestly, I get bored and then I need to move on to something else. Or like I watch a TV show or a movie and suddenly I'm like, oh, I need to go focus on that. So that's usually what happens. But there have definitely been times where I've wished I could focus on one time period and then just like make all the things for that and like have this complete wardrobe. I have everything I could ever need and just focus on that. And wouldn't that be great? but then I either get bored or more I just get excited about another time period and want to do that. So like recently my husband and I joined the SCA. So now our focus is shifting like even earlier and earlier, but yeah.
You're like, just add more work on yourself, right?
I know, it's really bad.
What else? I mean, listen, there are worse hobbies to have. There are worse hobbies, right? We could be doing much worse things.
Exactly.
So you mentioned TV show or movie. And so I was actually going to ask you, do you watch historical fiction? And are you able to watch it? And when, I'm not going to mention these shows specifically, but but we can.
Right.
I wasn't going to throw anybody under the bus, but we could. When you see that like the costuming is just not realistic, not accurate, does it make you crazy?
It depends.
Okay.
If the design itself is really good and serves the story, I'm fine with it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
If it's just like horrible design, I have no tolerance for it. And then there's like, if the show itself is good, I can forgive things. But if the show's just awful and the costumes aren't helping, then it's like,
you're out. I'm done.
There's no point.
I'm out. Right.
Yeah. Because I since I've also gotten to work on film projects doing costuming and historical advising, there are limitations, you know, whether that's coming from a director or a producer's vision to things as simple as lighting. I mean, it totally drives me crazy when women aren't wearing caps and that sort of thing, but having that bright white is really, really hard with lighting for film. So I get that, you know, I've tea-dyed and made things look dirty just because you can't have that bright white. So I get it, but it is frustrating.
I was going to say a certain Scottish show,
Oh, yes.
but in the book, she talks about not wearing a cap. So I'm like, I guess they're just trying to, but then they're they're just taking so many other liberties right now with that show.
I do like the design of that show, actually.
Yeah,
so,
you do.
And I figure it's a time travel show anyway, so
there's nothing that's,
it's fine. In that universe, it works.
It works. I think it's really interesting because they will dress out the background characters so much more accurately.
Yeah.
And then have the main characters. And I'm like, well, why?
I know.
What?
Well, it's probably because they're pulling from a stock warehouse somewhere that just happens to have.
It just happens to look
good stuff, and then the stuff they're specifically designing for the principals is from the imagination of the designer.
Yes. So. Oh, well, there you go. See, now that makes now.
Yeah.
Why would you go make that looks okay? And then
I know. Yeah. So it's probably because they're like, we need 25, you know, women's 18th century costumes, and then it's whatever they bring in from the warehouse. So,
I'll tell you, I liked historical fiction a lot more before I got into this hobby. I still love it, but it's so distracting now. And before I didn't know what any of that was. So now I'm just like.
But it does make me like really appreciate the shows that can get it right. Like The Witch movie for early 17th century was really exciting because they did so many things well.
I don't think I've watched that. Is that like a horror film?
I might not be the best person to ask about how horror-y. Like, my favorite movie is Silence of the Lambs, so I'm like not the person to ask.
Your level, your level of that, and my level of anxiety and scary movies is going to be a totally different place than yours.
So I don't think The Witch is scary at all. I think it's very atmospheric and creepy and moody. But it is probably the best portrayal of what 17th century people believed about witchcraft. So it's kind of this great, I mean, they took a lot of dialogue straight from original sources. So yeah, I just really like that.
Oh, is it set in the colonies or is it set in?
It is. It's set in like Massachusetts, I want to say.
Kind of like leading on to
it's like
eventually becomes the witch trials and all that.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Oh, I'll have to check that out. So that movie, that film, they did a great job with the costumes.
They did. They really did. I mean, all the women were wearing coifs or caps. They went to the extent of having the women have their hair put up correctly, because in the early 17th century, hair is taped, so either in braids or in twists. And then it's wrapped around the head and essentially sewn to the other hair to keep it in place. So you're not using hairpins. It actually gets sewn. So it looks like you have a crown around your head with this tape running through it. It's really pretty, actually.
Wow.
And they did that in the movie. So it was like that level of, you know.
That's cool.
Like, I was like, oh my God.
Are there any other shows or films that you really like, historical fiction wise, that you think have done a really good job?
The most recent Jane Eyre adaptation, I want to say like it was 2014, but with can't remember any of their names right now, but the most recent Jane Eyre, the costumes are just exquisite. Absolutely love it. So that's a favorite for sure.
I don't think I've watched. I'm trying to remember that. I don't think I've watched that one since then. Yeah. You know, it's like in this day and age, we have so much access to so much. It just goes in the repository. I can't even remember. We've watched it all. Okay. So I imagine, because you've been now doing this for many, many years, going back to starting being that 15-year-old at her first Civil War event in California. And because, you know, you have a YouTube channel now and a large following on social media, So what are some of the common things that people are, I imagine that there is like a pattern of the things that you get asked. It's probably on repeat, right? So what are some of those common questions that people have for you?
I think one of the most common is where to get materials. And I think that kind of depends on, what level of accuracy are you looking for? But I have, a list of suppliers that I always go to, such as Burley and Trowbridge. And we're lucky that we do have businesses that are specifically aimed at the historical customer. And it feels like there are more every day. So, places like Burley and Trowbridge, Renaissance Fabrics, have the historical customer in mind and are a great place to go. But I also, like, some of my, like, not really secrets, but like my little bag of tricks is I do find a lot of things on Etsy and eBay. You're taking a risk because there usually isn't any kind of swatch or refund policy or anything. But when I've found something good, it's been really good. And you just have to be willing to take the risk, but it also means training your eye. And that just comes with looking at all the originals you can. And that's where, like Pinterest, which is, you have to be careful with Pinterest sometimes, because images don't always come with their, correct attributions. And I've seen a lot of movie costumes get called originals, but really just taking the time to train your eye to the textiles that are correct. And once you get to that point, you can actually go into a Joann and look at the quilting cottons or whatever and find something that might work. One of my favorite 18th century, like working class gowns is a very simple, looks like a shell print from the 18th century. And I got that at Joann. So it is possible.
That's so cool.
Yeah. And it's one of those like, yes, I like managed to like beat the system somehow.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really helpful and inspiring though, because a lot of people are like, you think you can't go. I mean, you shouldn't go do that if you don't know what you're doing yet.
Right.
Practice and learn first.
So when I was little baby Samantha starting out, I volunteered at an assistance league thrift shop. And that was the first place where I bought wool because, someone had turned in 5 yards of wool that for whatever reason they didn't want anymore. And I was like, I know what that is. I need to get this. And so that was like my first 19th century cloak, and, probably didn't spend that much on it at all. So, if you're looking to do this economically, it's going to take a little more time and a little more research, but it can absolutely be done. And actually trying to come up with like how to hack Joann for the historical costumer might be a good future thing to think about.
I think you should totally think about that. I think a lot of people would be excited.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But how to hack Joann. I love it. Yeah. That's fun. It'll be like the new IKEA gown.
Right. Yeah. Seriously.
Exactly. Any other things that come up for you that people ask you?
Yeah. It usually gets broken down by like time period, and where to go for patterns or resources. I think we're lucky because right now School of Historical Dress has really picked up Janet Arnold's legacy and is committed to producing more books. And the books that they've put out specifically for 17th century have just been amazing. So I'm looking forward to new resources to be able to point people in that direction. One of the things that I struggle with helping people with tends to be 18th century patterns, just because I'm coming from a different place. I'm coming from having had, honestly, the privilege of learning how to drape and cut on the body. So it's harder for me to be like, if you use this pattern, you may not get the same result just because it's a different process. You absolutely can make a beautiful gown. So I just have to kind of give that caveat that for me, I just have a different background. But there have been some amazing patterns, and like the American Duchess book is really great about giving the information of how to take a pattern, whether it's their commercial pattern that they've been able to put out through simplicity and tweak it to make it more accurate. I mean, having that information out there is so amazing.
With the current situation and the lack of events, have you found that to be a negative thing where you're like, I really miss going to events? Some people are like, I've kind of enjoyed the downtime.
Yeah.
I miss seeing friends, but it's also like getting some stuff done. Where do you fall on that?
I'm the latter. I definitely miss friends, but I love making. Like, that will always be my biggest drive in this. I'm a little notorious for making things, wearing them a couple times and then selling them. I just really love making things. Yeah. So I was actually furloughed for a few months, and at first I was very, very upset about pretty much losing my job. But then I was like, I have things to do. And
I've got to get stuff done.
I've actually got stuff to do. So aside from making 400 masks, I also made, a new pair of stays, and I was able to take time to do things that I wouldn't usually do. Like, I actually lined my stays, which normally would never happen, because I didn't have a pressing deadline to do. So I was like, all right, I'm going to finish these completely, and really enjoy the process. So.
What's it like having two professional historic costumers in a house together?
Yeah. Well,
I wonder if people are wondering what that's like. I'm wondering what that's like.
I know. It is a good thing and a bad thing. So for the pros, I rarely get scolded about buying fabric and, wanting when my husband is like, look at this fabric, or, look at this sword. And I'm like, okay. Just because I know there's the thing that I want too.
Right.
And to a certain extent, we speak the same language about what we love and our passion and our jobs. So to that level, it's really nice. And it is nice to have somebody who can help me fit things. Although his training as a tailor and then what I've learned about mantua making are still going to be different. So sometimes I don't always stick with what he's done. I'm kind of like, I would have done that differently. But it is nice, when I can't reach something.
Pin that in, right.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also hard because it means that he knows enough that we can argue about it. So yeah, about, technique or some kind of choice, that we don't always see eye to eye on things either, which is funny. And the first time I ever did anything tailoring was my writing habit that I made 6 years ago. And he was helping me through the tailoring aspect of it. And it was like such a test of our marriage in a way. Because there were testing our communication, to have him try to explain something to me. And, even though it makes sense in his head, it may not make sense to me. And it just showed again the differences between 18th century tailoring and 18th century mantua making. He would tell me to do this stitch, and I would do it differently because that's how mantua makers do it. So I had to take all of this out and redo it. It was pretty funny. It's funny now. At the time,
yeah.
It was
it is. It's really. It is so interesting. It's the only kind of world I've ever been in. I don't know. I've done so many different things. I've had a very long career, I've been working. I've been in my career since I was 26. Since I was 17, 26 years. Wow. 17, 26 years. In one form or another, I've been doing some version of what I do now. And living history, there's nothing like it. You can't explain it to people outside of it.
No, you can't.
I wouldn't even know. So all the things that you just said about your relationship and the way you both sew, I know exactly what you're saying, and I get it. If anybody outside of our community watched this, they would just be like, what? Disagreeing about
I know.
sewing?
I know.
And that is why it is so magical and why we
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
so unique and interesting.
Absolutely.
This has
Absolutely.
been such a fun conversation. I feel like
Oh, it's so fun.
we're gonna have to do this again because we have a
Yes,
lot
please.
more that we have
Yeah,
to talk about. This has
definitely.
been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for
Oh no,
coming
thank you.
and chatting. And I'll make sure that everybody has the link to your YouTube and your Instagram and all the
Great.
places that you are, so they can come see all the fun things that you are doing. Thank you so much, Samantha. I hope you have a great
Thank you
one.
for having me.